In 1899, the era of outlaws is coming to an end. The United States is transforming into a land of laws, and even the West has been largely tamed. Only a few gangs, like Dutch's, remain active, but they are hunted down and eliminated. Cities and towns are connected by transportation and communication, while corporations like Leviticus Cornwalls control the land and wealth, hiring ruthless agencies like the Pinkertons to protect their interests. Dutch's gang attempted a robbery in Blackwater that ended in disaster. The Pinkertons ambushed them, and now the gang flees north, taking refuge in the mountains, saved by a storm. Without resources and with members missing or dead, they arrive at the abandoned mining town of Coulter, where they find shelter but lack supplies. John Marston and Micah are tasked with finding food. Dutch van der Linde leads the 24-member gang, with Hosea as his advisor and right-hand man, and Arthur Morgan, his main enforcer and our protagonist. Before continuing with the story, it's important to recap Arthur's life, which is filled with tragedies. Looking at his past is key to understanding him better, as well as his relationship with Dutch and the gang. Arthur was born in 1863, the son of Lyle and Beatrice Morgan. His mother died when he was very young, and though he doesn't remember her much, he keeps her photo by his tent with flowers, as she taught him they bring good luck. His father, Lyle, was a notorious outlaw, and it's implied he abused Arthur. In 1874, when Arthur was 11, Lyle was arrested for theft, and soon after, Arthur witnessed his death, something he later said couldn't have happened soon enough. Despite this, he keeps a portrait of his father and his hat. The items from his parents that Arthur still holds on to as an adult reflect how much he values family. Being orphaned left a deep emotional void in him and a strong need for belonging and connection. After 3 years surviving on the streets, he found what he was looking for. Dutch and Hosea took him in, becoming father figures to him. However, Arthur admits in his journal that, in many ways, he feels a deeper affection for Hosea, whom he sees as kind, fair, and above all, genuinely human. Shortly after, Dutch rescued John Marston, a 12-year-old orphan, and John became a brother to Arthur. Both became Dutch's favorite sons, and for the first time, Arthur felt he had found a family he truly belonged to. It's curious to observe how Dutch recruits people. It gives the impression that he has everything coldly calculated. When someone is going through a crisis or is emotionally vulnerable, their need for support, stability, and belonging skyrockets. In that state, the mind desperately seeks something to ease the anguish. If at that moment someone appears offering protection, guidance, or purpose, it's very likely that the vulnerable person will idealize that figure or group and develop a strong emotional attachment to them. Dutch understands this perfectly and, almost like a cult leader, identifies and recruits desperate people searching for purpose and a place to feel safe. That's how he builds a gang that follows and obeys him without question. The loss of his parents left Arthur alone and deeply vulnerable. When he found a new family in the gang with Dutch and Hosea, he clung to them and adopted their ideals and teachings. Dutch constantly spoke of values like loyalty and responsibility toward the gang, and these ideas became fundamental to Arthur to the point that he was willing to die for them. At one point, Arthur even declares that the gang is the only real thing in his life and that he would kill and die for it. But Arthur's tragedies didn't end there. Years later, Arthur met Mary, with whom he fell deeply in love and got engaged. However, Mary's father disapproved of Arthur's criminal life, leading to their breakup. Mary asked him to leave that life so they could run away together, but Arthur, out of loyalty to the gang and Dutch, refused. Mary ended up marrying another man, who died before the events of the game. Later, Arthur had a relationship with Eliza, with whom he had a son named Isaac. Though he couldn't promise much due to his lifestyle, he committed to doing right by them. Every few months, he visited, bringing money and gifts, and spent a few days with them. However, one day, upon arriving at their home, he found 2 crosses outside. His family had been killed by robbers for just $10. This event deeply scarred Arthur. Each loss rekindles the previous ones: the death of his parents, the end of his relationship with Mary, and now the loss of his son. The pain is so intense that he decided to bury the memories and dive even deeper into the criminal life. After 20 years in the gang, Arthur became Dutch's most trusted man, his right hand for any task requiring intimidation or brute force. He is a formidable fighter, an unstoppable gunslinger, and above all, loyal. But now, Arthur is about to face a process that will lead him to question everything he ever believed about Dutch, the gang, and especially himself. Back to the present, Dutch and Arthur ride out in search of supplies and find Micah, a recent addition who saved Dutch's life in a bar. Dutch and Micah were the ones who planned the failed Blackwater boat robbery. Dutch seems very impressed with Micah, who is impulsive, argumentative, and arrogant. Hosea and Arthur distrust him. Micah informs them about a small farm that might have supplies, but they discover it's occupied by members of the O'Driscoll gang, rivals with whom they have a deep enmity. After a shootout in a cabin, they interrogate the last survivor, who reveals that Colm O'Driscoll, Dutch's nemesis and leader, is hiding nearby with his gang and planning to rob a train. While searching the cabin, They find Sadie Adler. The O'Driscolls had invaded her home, killed her husband, and taken her hostage. Dutch decides to bring her into the gang. This group works together to survive, each with key skills. Susan Grimshaw keeps the camp in order, Pearson handles the food, and Karen, Marybeth, and Tilly use their talents as thieves and gather information. Strauss manages the accounts and handles loans. Uncle and Reverend Swanson are helpful in their own way, though more preoccupied with their vices. Bill, Javier, Charles, and Lenny provide strength and gun skills. Meanwhile, John Marston, Arthur's adopted brother, is lost in the storm, feared dead. John is another main character, and his story is also important for analyzing Arthur. After being taken in by Dutch and growing up in the gang, in 1894, John fell in love with Abigail, a prostitute who joined the group. Together, they had a son, Jack. However, John doubted whether Jack was really his son, which led him to shirk his role as a father and abandon the gang for a year. This abandonment had a strong impact on Arthur. Considering Arthur's history of family losses, it's understandable why, for him, what John did was a betrayal. Not only did he abandon the surrogate family Arthur saw as sacred, but he also abandoned his own family. This likely struck a nerve with Arthur. On one hand, he could identify with young Jack and relive the pain he felt losing his parents as a child. On the other, it may have reminded him of the loss of his own family later in life, fueling his resentment toward John. Arthur couldn't understand how someone could disregard something as valuable as family, something he had lost and deeply cherished. When John returned, most gang members welcomed him back, but Arthur still felt betrayed, and it took him a long time to forgive him. In the present, Arthur and Javier go looking for John. On the way, Arthur learns that Dutch killed a girl for no reason during the Blackwater heist, and says that's not the Dutch he knows. They find John injured and harassed by wild animals, but manage to return safely to Coulter. Dutch gathers the gang to scout a nearby O'Driscoll camp, saying they're looking for supplies, though Arthur and Hosea suspect he's seeking revenge. Dutch and Colm were once allies, but became enemies when Dutch killed Colm's brother, and Colm killed Annabelle, the woman Dutch loved. Arthur reminds him that he's always said revenge is a luxury they can't afford, but Dutch insists this isn't just revenge. He says he wants information about the train heist the O'Driscolls are planning. Dutch's gang attacks the camp, but Colm has escaped. They take out the O'Driscolls there, steal dynamite and plans to rob Cornwall's train, and take Kieran Duffy hostage, hoping he might be useful. Dutch doesn't waste time and robs the train, successfully stealing bonds. However, after the trouble caused in Blackwater and this new heist, the gang makes more enemies in Cornwall's corporation. With the thaw, the gang moves to the plains. Dutch sends Lenny and Micah to scout, and they eventually arrive at Horseshoe Overlook, near the town of Valentine. The camp, with Dutch at the center alongside his often ignored girlfriend, Molly O'Shea, becomes a home. Meanwhile, Kieran remains a prisoner until they decide his fate. Dutch reminds them they need money, and each gang member contributes in some way. Strauss sets up a loan business, and Arthur collects the debts. Hosea sells stolen wagons, and Charles hunts. The women also provide leads. Marybeth about a train robbery and Karen about a bank heist. The effort takes its toll, and the gang decides to rest in Valentine at a saloon. Bill starts a fight that spirals out of control. Tommy, the local tough guy, steps in and fights Javier, who can't hold his own. Bill asks Arthur to help Javier. Arthur faces Tommy, but Tommy overpowers him, throwing him through a window before continuing the fight outside. After an intense struggle, Arthur gains the upper hand and nearly beats Tommy to death before things escalate further. A farmer and charity collector named Thomas Down steps in and stops the fight. Later, Arthur goes hunting with Hosea, who recalls his late wife, Bessie. Arthur asks if he misses her, and Hosea says every day. He also asks if they ever considered leaving the criminal life, and Hosea admits they thought about it, but didn't last. Then Hosea asks if Arthur is thinking about getting out, to which Arthur firmly denies. Hosea says that if Dutch's plans work and they get enough money, maybe they can start fresh somewhere else. This conversation feels very significant because it gives clues about what Arthur is feeling at this point in the story. With Cornwall and the government closing in, and Dutch acting in increasingly contradictory ways, Arthur starts to question whether this criminal life makes sense. I think this moment of crisis leads him to think about Mary and the life he left behind to stay with the gang and his outlaw path. That's why, when Hosea recalled his wife Bessie and said he missed her every day, Arthur asked if he ever thought about leaving this life. In reality, though he doesn't dare admit it, Arthur is thinking about Mary and projecting his own doubts and regrets about what could have been or could be a different life. Later, Dutch interrogates Kieran, who reveals that Colm O'Driscoll is hiding at 6 Point Cabin. Kieran leads them there. They take out several O'Driscolls, but Colm isn't there. During the confrontation, Kieran saves Arthur, earning the right to stay in the gang as a free man. Arthur has debts to collect, a job he finds repulsive and shameful. He knows that often these debts aren't collected from wealthy people, but from those already in extreme poverty, like Thomas Downs, a sick, desperate man with no money. Arthur confronts him at his ranch and, when he doesn't get the money, brutally beats him. During the beating, Thomas coughs blood that gets in Arthur's eye. Thomas collapses, and his wife, Edith, runs to him. Their son, Archie, looks at Arthur as if he were the devil, and maybe to him, he is. Edith begs Arthur, explaining that Thomas is gravely ill and asking for more time. But Arthur, indifferent, insists they're not a charity and demands they get the money before leaving. Inside, Arthur feels disgusted by the incident and his role in it. He reflects that maybe he was wrong. Later, Thomas dies, leaving Edith and Archie completely destitute. Collecting debts is something Arthur loathes. So why does he do things that conflict with him so much morally? One reason, no doubt, is his strong sense of responsibility toward the camp. For Arthur, the gang isn't just a group of outlaws, it's his family. There are 24 people in the camp who depend on everyone's contributions to survive, including women and children who can't fend for themselves. Arthur feels he has to do his part, even if it means crossing lines he finds distasteful. In his mind, the survival of his people justifies his actions. However, I don't think all his justifications come down to his responsibility to the gang. When confronted about his actions, Arthur often justifies himself by blaming the world. He says things like, "This country is wild. It's not my fault the world is this way." These responses reveal a lot. If we recall his story, it's easy to understand why Arthur might think this way. His life was marked by tragedies from a very young age, likely leading him to believe the world is inherently cruel. This belief can be a way to shield himself from pain, a way to depersonalize suffering. If the world is harsh to everyone, then the tragedies he experienced don't feel personal but inevitable. This thinking might also help Arthur justify his actions. If the world is naturally ruthless, then what he does, no matter how terrible, isn't an exception but part of how things work. From that perspective, Arthur sees himself as just another piece of a much larger, cruel system. Though deep down he knows many of his actions are morally questionable, he convinces himself that those people would have suffered anyway, whether by his hand or someone else's. Lenny returns to Camp Shaken. He and Micah had disappeared after being sent to scout. Micah was arrested in Strawberry for murder after killing a man in a drunken altercation. Arthur can't stand Micah and doesn't want to help him, but Dutch insists that, despite his arrogance, he's a good man. Reluctantly, Arthur agrees and frees him. Upon rescuing him, Arthur tells Micah he's lucky Dutch has his back, to which Micah replies that they're family now. Being Dutch's sons makes them brothers. Then Josiah, a con man and occasional gang member, shows up with news about Sean McGuire, who was captured by bounty hunters after the failed Blackwater heist. With the information about Sean, the gang organizes his rescue. While he's being transported, they infiltrate and free him. It's a small victory for the gang, though they still have much to do. Meanwhile, John Marston has nearly fully recovered and returned to work. However, his family at camp is often neglected. Young Jack finds father figures among the camp members, like Arthur, who even takes him fishing. Arthur thinks Jack is a good kid, a dreamer, a child with a mother who loves him. He wonders if Jack will find what they're searching for, peace and truth, far from all this madness and lies. Having stolen assets, trains, and sabotaged Cornwall's businesses, the gang has become a major target. While Arthur and Jack are packing up, Pinkerton agents Milton and Ross appear. Milton tells Arthur he's a wanted man with a $5,000 bounty on his head, but that they really want Dutch. If Arthur turns him in, Milton promises he'll have no trouble. Loyal, Arthur refuses and returns to Dutch. When Arthur asks what they'll do, Dutch says nothing, just stay calm. Dutch doesn't seem too worried, but Arthur begins to question the wisdom behind his indifference. For now, they're safe. Arthur meets up with John for a job, stealing sheep and selling them in Valentine. Arthur reflects that this life will soon end. By this point, it's clear how Arthur's doubts about his criminal life have grown, especially as he notices Dutch acting in ways very different from what he preached his whole life. For years, Dutch built the group's identity on an ethical code that supposedly set them apart from common criminals. He spoke of ideals of freedom, protecting the gang, and resisting government and corporate control. From his early days in the gang, Arthur believed in those ideals. In their first major heist in 1887, Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur not only stole gold from a bank, but distributed it to the city's neediest, slums, orphanages, and shanties. That act was a statement of principles. They weren't mere thieves, they were different. They robbed those who could afford it and helped the poor, respecting certain ethical boundaries. Women and children were untouchable, violence was a last resort, and revenge was out of the question. This philosophy gave the gang a purpose beyond mere survival. But the current situation, plus Dutch's recent actions, suggests it was all a facade. During the Blackwater heist, Dutch killed a girl for no apparent reason, leaving Arthur baffled. It wasn't a necessary or strategic act. It was a display of impulsiveness and brutality that clashed with everything Dutch had taught them. Since then, Dutch's decisions seemed driven more by revenge and ego than the gang's well-being. This inconsistency strikes at Arthur's identity and possibly that of other gang members. Arthur had justified his criminal life based on Dutch's ideals and teachings. Everything he'd done, the robberies, the violence, the suffering he caused, made sense because he believed it served a greater purpose. But if those ideals were just empty words, and Dutch isn't the man Arthur thought he was, then what's the point of this criminal life? If the ideals that sustained it are a facade, what's left? Worse, does it mean Arthur has been nothing but a bad man with no purpose or true justification for his actions? In fact, Arthur writes in his journal at one point, "My entire code, the one that guided my life and for which I killed, was it true, or was there a greater truth I was too foolish to see?" After taking the stolen sheep to Valentine, they meet Dutch and Strauss at the saloon. When John and Strauss step out, Cornwall bursts in outside, demanding the rest come out. Cornwall introduces himself and accuses the gang of continuing to rob him. He warns that he's not someone to mess with and orders his men to deal with them before leaving. Arthur frees his friends, and the gang shoots their way out to escape Valentine. They know they can't stay and decide to flee. They camp by a lake, and Charles and Arthur help a German family who nearly killed themselves by accident. Arthur reflects that Charles is a better man than him. He doesn't need to think to do good. It comes naturally, as if it's the right thing. The gang heads to Clemens Point, near Rhodes, where they enter a region divided by two warring families, the Greys and the Braithwaites. The Greys, tobacco plantation owners, control half the businesses in Rhodes. Gray is the town sheriff. The Braithwaites, former slaveholders and cotton growers, now produce illegal moonshine. Since the Civil War, the families have been at odds for years. Dutch sees an opportunity and splits the group. Arthur will investigate the Greys, while Hosea will do the same with the Braithwaites. Dutch explains his plan to Arthur: gain the trust of both families, rob them, and escape before they realize the truth. Meanwhile, Sadie Adler, emerging from her grief, feels trapped in the camp's minor tasks. At the Adler Ranch, she was self-sufficient and shared everything with her husband, even the house. Now, desperate, she wants to take on tougher jobs. Arthur decides to take her to Rhodes, where they face an attack from a local gang, but manage to defend themselves. Sadie, driven by hatred and vengeance against the O'Driscolls, fights with a fury and bloodlust that's frightening, proving she can fight as well as any man in the gang. Arthur returns to Edith Downs' home, now a widow, to collect Thomas's debt. She says she's almost paid it all. Arthur replies that her husband knew the rules when he took the money and that he's sorry for how things turned out, but insists Thomas had a choice and justifies himself by saying it's not his fault the world is this way. Edith retorts that her husband had no choice, that Thomas was a good man who helped others, and that Arthur killed him. She tells him not to fool himself, that the one who really had a choice was Arthur. Finally, Edith hands over the money. To me, this conversation is crucial for Arthur's development. For years, he's believed his life is out of his control and that he has no choice but to follow the path Dutch set. Dutch instilled a worldview where absolute loyalty was paramount. Dutch demonizes anyone who contradicts or questions his authority. Disloyalty, real or perceived, is punished immediately, leaving little room for gang members to think or act independently. In this environment, Arthur convinced himself there was no life outside the gang, that he couldn't survive alone, and that all he could do was follow orders, even when they repulsed him. But what Mrs. Downs said confronts him with the uncomfortable truth that he's always had a choice. No one forced him to obey Dutch, to intimidate, steal, or hurt others. Her words plant a seed that will sprout later. If he's always had a choice, then the future can be different, one where he might start making truly his own decisions. Dutch's plan with the Gray and Braithwaite families gets underway. The gang helps the Gray seize illegal moonshine from the Braithwaites, sells it back to them, and then distributes it at Rhodes Saloon to hurt their profits. They also steal horses from the Braithwaites and burn the Gray's tobacco fields, manipulating both sides while sowing chaos, all in hopes of finding information about supposed Confederate gold hidden between the families. Though far from Valentine, the Pinkertons remain a threat. The gang learns the O'Driscolls are seeking a peace treaty. Despite his hatred for Colm, Dutch agrees to attend, though they suspect a trap. Arthur takes position with his rifle, but their suspicions are correct. Dutch and Micah escape unharmed, but Arthur is captured. The O'Driscolls plan to use Arthur to lure Dutch and turn him over to the Pinkertons for freedom. However, Arthur escapes, foiling their plan. In Rhodes, the Grays and Braithwaites uncover the gang's plans and decide to take them out. The Grays set up a meeting to ambush Arthur, Sean, Bill, and Micah, and when they arrive, Sean is killed instantly. Though the Grays underestimate the gang's strength and are quickly wiped out, for Arthur, Sean was like a younger, somewhat annoying brother. He recalls the good times they shared riding together. They're making a mess of all this. Meanwhile, Catherine Braithwaite, upon learning of her stolen horses, kidnaps young Jack in retaliation. The legendary gold dividing these families seems to be just a myth, the gang concludes. Determined, the gang members storm the Braithwaites and discover Jack was handed over to Angelo Bronte in St. Denis. However, before going after him, the Pinkertons find Dutch in what they thought was a safe camp. Agent Milton tests the gang's loyalty by offering to take Dutch and let the rest go free. But the gang draws their weapons, and the Pinkertons retreat empty-handed. Now that the Pinkertons have located them, It's time to move again. Shady Belle becomes their new refuge. Molly tries to talk to Dutch, but he ignores her, saying he has far more important things to think about. Dutch and Arthur ride towards St. Denis. Dutch admits he long believed they'd find a paradise somewhere in the West, but he's no longer sure. Now he plans to take the gang abroad, though not yet. Before any decision, they need money. Their goal in this progressive city is to secure funds and rescue Jack, John's son, who's in the hands of Angelo Bronte, a gangster who controls the city, including the law and the mayor. They track Angelo to his mansion. He offers to return Jack, and they do a simple job for him. The gang completes the task, and Jack returns safe and sound. Arthur visits a church and meets Sister Calderon, who teaches children to read. Their conversation is interrupted when a boy steals her crucifix. Arthur chases him to retrieve it, but the sister asks him not to hurt the boy. After recovering the crucifix, Arthur runs into Edith Downs, Thomas's widow, the sick man he beat for not paying a debt. Edith, now in St. Denis working as a prostitute to support her son, confronts him with shame and hatred, accusing him of harassing her in front of an officer. With no options, Arthur withdraws silently. He then returns the crucifix to the sister, who thanks him deeply, explaining it was a memento from her mother and calls him the most wonderful man. The contrast between Arthur's actions lets us appreciate his inner conflict. On one hand, we see him intimidating people like Thomas Downs, collecting debts from the poorest and most desperate, acts that disgust him, but that he somehow feels are part of his duty to the gang. But then we also discover a completely different Arthur. We saw him help a German family on the verge of death and retrieve Sister Calderon's crucifix, two entirely selfless acts. These moments show there's a constant struggle within Arthur between a cold, brutal side and a kind one. This inner conflict is what makes him so compelling. On one hand, he meets the gang's expectations, acting as the tough, ruthless man Dutch needs. But on the other, he can't help showing compassion and humanity when he encounters people who need his help. Later, Arthur receives a letter from Mary Linton, his former girlfriend, who's staying at a hotel in St. Denis. Arthur decides to visit her. Both are glad to reconnect. Mary asks if it's too late for them. Arthur confesses he wants nothing more than to run away with her, but he must first take care of the gang. Once they're free and he has money, they can leave together. Mary promises to write him. St. Denis is under Angelo Bronte's control, who dominates the law and government and seeks to manipulate Dutch's gang for his own ends. He invites them to a high society ball hosted by the mayor to kick off his plan. Key figures threatening the gang's lifestyle are present, like Howard Crawley, an army representative pushing economic expansion in the U.S. and islands like Garma, and Alberto, a Cuban in charge in Garma, who supports Cornwall's sugar empire while oppressing his people. The Wapiti tribe is also there, asking the government to honor their treaty and stop Cornwall from drilling oil on their land. For now, though, the guest's agenda isn't the gang's priority, which leaves with key information for future heists: a casino, a trolley station, and their biggest target, a bank. They have a new plan in motion, but the Pinkertons aren't the only ones looking to take down Dutch. The O'Driscolls attack the camp, forcing the gang to fall back to the house. Sadie is trapped outside, and when Arthur tries to help her, he witnesses the rage and hatred Sadie has built up against the O'Driscolls since they killed her husband. Sadie already saw herself as a capable outlaw, and from that moment, the gang recognizes it too. They prevail, but lose another member, Kieran Duffy. Later, Sadie and Dutch witness Colm O'Driscoll's execution, but it doesn't quell their anger. Dutch warns that if the O'Driscolls found the camp, the Pinkertons aren't far behind. He says they need enough money for a ship to take them to Australia or Tahiti and mentions finding a captain willing to make it happen. The casino heist yields a good haul, but it's not enough. Then Bronte, posing as their ally, suggests robbing a train station, but it's a trap. St. Denis Law was waiting at a trolley that crashes, leaving Dutch with a severe concussion. Though Dutch insists he's fine, Arthur notices a change in him. Dutch feels humiliated by how Angelo manipulated him. He decides it's time to confront him. Hosea and Arthur question if this is just for revenge, but Dutch insists Angelo is the only thing stopping them from getting the bank money they need to escape. Hosea disagrees, believing there's always a simpler way. Dutch insists there's no other option. Hosea warns he's dooming them all. The gang storms Angelo's mansion, takes out his men, and Dutch brutally kills him, throwing him to the alligators, justifying it with "it was him or us." Though he always said he only killed those who deserved it, this time he acts like a mobster. Arthur, shocked, realizes these aren't mere mistakes but a deep change in his mentor that's leading them to ruin. Arthur has started having coughing fits. The bank heist, planned by Hosea, is their last attempt to get money to escape to Tahiti. Arthur doubts it will work, but Dutch accuses him of being closed-minded and says if he wants to split the family and go their separate ways, he should say so. Arthur says that's not what he wants. Dutch complains that he feels Micah is the only loyal one left. With that, the bank heist begins. Hosea and Abigail stage a distraction. The gang moves in, but the Pinkertons are waiting, with Hosea as a hostage. Hosea, Dutch's partner and voice of reason, is killed by Agent Milton. John is arrested. With Hosea dead and John captured, the rest flee across the rooftops, but Lenny is gunned down. The survivors take refuge in an abandoned building. St. Denis is locked down, and the only way out is by sea. Charles distracts the Pinkertons while the others stow away on a ship bound for Cuba. However, a storm forces them to abandon the ship, and they end up on the island of Garma, where they're captured by the sugar plantation's overseer, a trusted man of Alberto. Alberto and his men exploit the land and people to fill Cornwall's ships and maximize profits. But rebels fight this oppression, freeing their chained comrades and Dutch's men. In the chaos, Javier is injured and captured. To leave the island and reunite with the others, they need to rescue Javier. The rebels know where he is and, in exchange for help with their cause, promise to secure a ship. Arthur joins Dutch for the mission. Since the failed Blackwater heist, Arthur couldn't understand how Dutch could kill an innocent to achieve his goals. Now he witnesses it firsthand when a woman guiding them asks for more money. Dutch kills her, saying she was going to betray them. This act wasn't against a mobster or enemy, but someone who seemed to be helping. Arthur, stunned, confirms the man he admired no longer exists. They free Javier, fight Alberto and his men, and escape the island toward Van Horn. They disembark separately to reunite with the rest of the gang. Arthur follows to a cave with Dutch nearby. The Pinkertons are waiting again, but under fire, Sadie and Arthur flank them, forcing a retreat. What's left of the gang is together, except Molly, Dutch's girlfriend, and John, who's still imprisoned. Dutch suspects John may have betrayed them to the Pinkertons, but Sadie thinks otherwise. They find new refuge in Beaver Hollow. Uncle finds Molly, drunk, and when he brings her to Dutch, she, tired of being ignored, claims she betrayed the bank heist. Dutch, furious, points a gun at her. Arthur tries to stop him, pleading not to shoot, but Miss Grimshaw shoots first, saying she knew the rules. Arthur, what the hell is wrong with you? At this point, we can see a significant change in Arthur. He wanted to let Molly go, even in the face of her supposed betrayal. Before, Arthur wouldn't have hesitated to follow the group's rules, but now he's starting to lean more toward his compassionate and kind side. Arthur goes to sleep and dreams of a young deer drinking from a lake, reflecting the moral direction his life is taking. Arthur heads to St. Denis to meet Sadie and try to free John, but collapses on the way. His coughing fits have worsened. Rescued and taken to a doctor, he receives a grave diagnosis: tuberculosis, contracted weeks ago from Thomas Downs, who was dying. Leaving the doctor's office, Arthur sees a deer like the one in his dream, but as he approaches, we realize it was just a hallucination. Knowing his time is running out leads Arthur to reflect on what kind of man he's been and whether the world is full of fury or love. He believes there's nothing good in him, yet he sees goodness in people like Abigail and her love for Jack or Thomas Downs, who fought for the poor despite starving. When Arthur meets Dutch, he asks what the plan is now, as they've been hunted everywhere. Where are they headed? Arthur is worried about saving lives, especially the women in camp. Dutch says he sounds like Hosea, admits he has no final plan, but insists he just needs time and no traitors. Dutch demands loyalty, and he used to earn it with words of love, but for some time now, his actions no longer match his words. Arthur goes to sleep and dreams again of a young deer drinking from a lake. At dawn, he decides to head out with Sadie to rescue John without telling Dutch. He knows Dutch won't like it, but he feels the years of blind loyalty are over. He's loyal, yes, but not blindly. Not until Dutch can see the disaster they're in and who his real friends are. Sadie and Arthur manage to break John out of prison and bring him back to camp. Arthur reflects that he did it for Abigail, the most incredible woman he knows, but also for Jack and, in part, for John himself. Though they've argued for years, Arthur admits he cares about him. He believes John has stopped being as foolish as before and might have the luck that always eluded Arthur, as Jack is an innocent child, and in him, Arthur sees what he missed out on. Arthur was already grappling with doubts about the life he'd led, but the tuberculosis diagnosis is what finally shakes him. His time is limited, and looking back with a clarity he never had before, now that the ideals and justifications have crumbled, he feels the balance of his actions doesn't favor him at all. He's not proud of who he's been. The weight of his decisions has caught up with him. Over 20 years of a criminal life can't be undone, and the time he has left doesn't seem enough to right all the harm he's caused. But at the same time, the diagnosis frees him, giving him new clarity about what truly matters and pushing him to finally act on the emotions and thoughts he'd been harboring for a while. Edith Downs' words start to make sense, and we see an Arthur who, for the first time, makes a decision independent of Dutch, freeing John. This act marks a crucial shift in his priorities. His current concern is helping and saving lives. Though he doesn't feel it will be enough to redeem him, it's at least a way to make up for something. Paradoxically, the same man who collected debts from people who couldn't pay now feels crushed by a debt he considers impossible to settle. Abigail is overjoyed at John's return, but Dutch doesn't share her happiness. He's furious that they rescued John instead of following his plan. Later, Arthur learns Dutch and Micah went to Ansburg after Cornwall. Arthur follows them. Together, Micah believes there's a snitch, but Arthur thinks they've just gotten sloppier. Arthur suggests leaving Cornwall alone, as they need money, not revenge. But Dutch insists it's just a social visit, and plans to negotiate for Cornwall to call off the Pinkertons. At the dock, when Cornwall's ship arrives, Dutch and the others emerge from hiding. Dutch demands a ship, $10,000, and safe passage in exchange for sparing Cornwall's life, but Cornwall refuses, and Dutch kills him. As Arthur processes his new worldview, he runs into Mrs. Downs, who asks him to stay away. He apologizes and says this country and its men are wild, and it's no more his fault than anyone else's. But she replies that instead of unleashing chaos, he should unleash kindness. Arthur wonders how to do that when all he knows is fighting. When he asks about her son, she says he's working in the mine until exploitation makes him sick, which won't take long. Arthur considers stepping in, but she insists he leave them alone and find another fight. This encounter teaches Arthur another important lesson. As I said before, he believed his actions were inevitable, just a response to the ruthless world he lived in. Thinking that way was easier because it let him justify the harm he caused and avoid facing guilt. In his mind, he was just doing what was needed to survive, following the rules of a cruel world. But Mrs. Downs' words challenged that belief. As she told him, Arthur always had a choice, and this is a reminder that those choices matter. Though the world may be harsh and full of injustices, that doesn't mean people have to add to that chaos. Everyone chooses what they contribute to the world, more chaos or more kindness. This encounter leaves a mark on Arthur, who then seeks ways to unleash kindness. Arthur goes to the mine looking for Archie, Edith's son, and finds him being harassed by men mocking his mother's work. Arthur steps in, takes a punch from one of them, but knocks him out with one blow and frees Archie. Archie, worried, says things will now get worse, but Arthur tells him he has money to give him and his mother so they can leave. He asks him to talk to her. Later, Arthur gets an order from Strauss to collect another debt. When he tracks down the debtor, the foreman tells him he's dead and to talk to his widow. Arthur finds her with her son, and she explains they can't pay, asking if he wants her son's shoes, their food, or for her to sleep with him. She says her husband worked himself to death to pay debts, and now they're about to lose their house. Moved, Arthur forgives the debt. She thanks him, but also reproaches him and Strauss for doing this to people. Arthur returns to camp and confronts Strauss. He drags him to his tent and says he won't kill him, though he should. He throws the debt ledger on the ground and expels him from camp, telling him to get a job. Later, Arthur returns to Edith Downs' home to see if she accepted the money, but she refuses. She asks him to let go of guilt and says all he can do now is decide what kind of man he wants to be with the time he has left. Arthur agrees and insists on the money so they can start over. He admits he ruined her life and suffers for it every day, but begs her not to let pride destroy them. Finally, she accepts the money and thanks him. Arthur reflects that Edith saw him for what he is, a killer seeking redemption. But he thinks that's not it. He doesn't want to save himself because he believes he doesn't deserve it, only to help some people. Throughout the story, Arthur has shown he's not just a hardened criminal. We've seen several moments where his humanity and kindness shine through. What's interesting, though, is that Arthur doesn't allow himself to recognize that side of himself. Perhaps, with the clarity brought by his nearing end, Arthur is painfully aware of the harm he's caused, and that guilt torments him. In his mind, he feels it's too late to change. He's convinced that no matter how many good things he tries to do now, he'll die a bad man. But next, Arthur will have a conversation that completely changes his perspective. Arthur visits Sister Calderon and tells her about his illness. He confesses he feels he's led a bad life. The sister replies that everyone leads bad lives, everyone sins, but Arthur's problem is he doesn't know himself. She explains that every time they meet, she sees him helping others and smiling. Arthur recalls the losses he's suffered since childhood, and the sister says life is full of pain, but also love and beauty. When Arthur asks what he should do now, she tells him to be grateful, as for the first time, he can see his life clearly. She suggests he help someone, as that makes him happy. Arthur confesses, with brutal honesty, that he's scared. The sister listens and says there's nothing to fear, encouraging him to bet on love and do a kind act. The sister's words ease Arthur's fear and make him think maybe he still has something to fight for. Arthur commits to trying. This scene is beautiful and, to me, represents the emotional climax of the story. So, I want to pause to comment on a few things. First, this scene shows a side of Arthur we rarely see. A vulnerable, completely honest man. Arthur has always been the archetype of a man trying to project strength, as if nothing affects him. He's the kind of man who keeps his emotions to himself because he believes showing weakness isn't an option. Yet, as players, we know his reality is far more complex. We know what Arthur has lived through and what he's facing. We understand because we've read his journal, seen his innermost thoughts, and know how much everything weighs on him. That's why this scene hits so hard. For the first time, we see Arthur take off the mask. The moment he admits he's scared is incredibly powerful, and we feel the weight of his words, not only because we understand how hard it is for him to say, but because, in some way, many of us see ourselves in him. Many men have been in that position, pretending we're fine, projecting a facade of strength while inside we're broken or consumed by fear. Arthur embodies that internal struggle so many face, the misguided idea that being strong means not showing weakness, that admitting fear is failure. But in this scene, Arthur teaches us there's no shame in being vulnerable, in admitting we don't have all the answers, and in letting others help carry the load. Seeing Arthur, a man who's endured so much, finally acknowledge his fear feels like catharsis, because in his vulnerability, he gives us permission to explore our own. On the other hand, by this point, Arthur had already received several messages that deeply impacted him, like Mrs. Downs' words. Yet, a persistent fear remained, the fear of dying without finding redemption. What's interesting, and likely not coincidental, is that the relief he seeks comes through Sister Calderon. On a symbolic level, she represents a connection to the divine. Arthur, in his situation, is grappling with profound spiritual doubts. Perhaps, unconsciously, he was more open to hearing what Sister Calderon had to say, as if, in that moment, he was facing God through her words. What Sister Calderon told Arthur is phenomenal. She assures him she knows him, that every time she's seen him, he's been helping others and smiling. She shows him that being good or bad isn't defined in the abstract or just by what you think of yourself, but is reflected in the impact your actions have on others' lives. It's true Arthur has caused pain and suffering to many for the wrong reasons, but the sister tries to make him see something more, that there's also a compassionate, kind side to him he's shown more than once. Perhaps the chance to redeem oneself, for Arthur and any of us, comes when we can see our life clearly, because once we're aware of our mistakes, what's right, and what we must do, not changing becomes a conscious choice. Here's the fundamental shift for Arthur. Until then, he thought redemption was like tallying good and bad deeds at the end of life to see if the balance was positive or negative. And if it worked that way, he'd likely never have enough time to make up for all he'd done. This idea led him to believe someone like him couldn't be redeemed. Plus, if redemption worked like that, how would it be measured? And who sets the rules? Arthur starts to realize it's not like that. True redemption isn't about numbers or trades. It comes when you choose to do what's right simply because it's right, without expecting anything in return, without seeking absolution. That's Arthur's transformation, stopping worrying about making up for his past and focusing on what he can do here and now. And in that shift, he'll find something he'd been searching for his whole life: peace. Arthur dreams again of the deer by the lake. Another day, Arthur shares his illness with Charles, who says, in a way, he's lucky. Any day they could die, maybe that very night. In a way, it's a gift to know he still has time to make things right. The others, Hosea, Lenny, Sean, didn't. Arthur has the chance to do something better. Having killed Cornwall, a man more powerful than the government, the gang now has not just the Pinkertons but the entire law and army after them. To buy time, they destroy a bridge and slow the army. However, the gang now pursues different goals, with an irreparable divide among them. John confesses he's been nervous, thinking a lot about prison and how he no longer recognizes Dutch. He thinks Dutch now enjoys killing in cold blood, seeking revenge, and creating more chaos. He also feels this escape plan isn't right. Arthur agrees. John admits he loves Dutch and is grateful for saving him years ago, but feels he could have done more for him when he was arrested. Arthur tells him he should escape with his wife and son. John asks about loyalty, and Arthur says to be loyal to what really matters. John asks what Arthur will do, and Arthur, coughing, says he'll be fine and asks him to do it for him, as it will bring him peace. Arthur receives a letter from Mary. She says she misses him and always will, but his world feels like a trap she can't escape, and she can't live like that. She writes that there's a good man in him, but he's fighting a giant that wins time and again. Finally, she says goodbye forever. Arthur wonders what he expected. They were never meant to be, and they really never were. Yet, somehow, in the end, he discovered he had a heart because it was broken. He feels sad and confused, torn between different ideas of who he was, and it turns out he was neither. Later, Charles and Arthur have done all they can to help the Wapiti tribe and their leader, Rain's fall. He explains that though they made peace treaties, the army broke them. They've been displaced and punished repeatedly. Now, the army seeks to provoke the natives and destroy the agreement, allowing Cornwall's empire to drill oil on their land. Dutch notices Eagle Fly's impulsive nature, Rain's false son. Eagle sums it up clearly. The colonel is a liar and killer, and they won't stop until the tribe is wiped out. Dutch incites Eagle Flies to attack the oil plant, believing a conflict between the army and natives would be the distraction they need to rob and escape. Before the heist, Arthur dreams again of the deer by the lake, slowly turning its head toward him. The day of the attack arrives. The gang rides with the natives. With Eagle Flies in danger, they fight to help him, but the army arrives with heavy artillery. Arthur and Dutch manage to enter the factory for the bonds, but the army blocks their escape. Arthur gets trapped after falling through a broken pipe and is ambushed by soldiers. Dutch, though he could help, abandons him. Eagle Fly saves him but is wounded by the colonel. Arthur acts quickly and kills the colonel. Arthur confronts Dutch for abandoning him, but he denies it. Arthur and Charles take Eagle Flies back to his father. On the way, Charles notes Dutch has become the kind of man he said they should never be. Arthur replies maybe he always was, recalling how they used to have lines they didn't cross, even helped others, but those lines vanished long ago. Charles says it's time they draw their own lines. When they return Eagle Flies to his father, he dies. Arthur returns to camp, now a shadow of what it was. By then, many gang members have fled. Uncle, Mary Beth, Karen, Reverend Swanson, and the cook Pearson. Dutch is lost. It's unclear if he changed or just showed his true self. For years, Hosea, his best friend, was his guide, but with his absence and Micah's influence, Dutch now follows advice from someone who feeds his ego and fuels chaos. Micah is pushing him to be the man he was before, one who kills innocents, prioritizes revenge, and leaves the weak behind. With his illness advancing and the world closing in, Arthur wants to protect those he cares about most. He agrees to help Dutch with one last heist, but insists that afterward, they let the women and children go. Though annoyed, Dutch agrees. The gang boards the train for their final heist. During the assault, John is wounded. Dutch and Micah promise to return for him, while the rest blow the car and secure the haul they always dreamed of. When Arthur asks about John, Micah says the patrol killed him, and they had to flee. Tilly, with Jack, finds the gang and tells them the Pinkertons captured Abigail. Micah interrupts, saying she's just a girl, and Dutch, agreeing with Micah, apologizes to Arthur before ordering them to move on. But Arthur promises Jack he'll rescue his mom. Arthur and Sadie reach Van Horn and fight to free Abigail, but Sadie is captured. Arthur pushes forward and confronts Milton, who reveals Micah has been informing since they captured him and offered a deal. Milton also admits Molly never talked, though they tried to pressure her. Suddenly, Abigail appears and kills Milton. Sadie, Abigail, and Arthur flee on horseback, facing the Pinkertons. Exhausted, Arthur asks them to stop. He tells Abigail they think John is dead and that he loved her and Jack. He asks them to find the boy while he returns to camp to try to free Dutch from Micah's influence. At camp, Arthur accuses Micah of being the snitch, but he denies it. Tension rises as they point guns at each other. Micah is a key foil to Arthur in the story. Both are criminals in the same gang, but they represent completely opposite sides. Arthur doesn't act out of pleasure or malice. His actions are often driven by loyalty to the gang, necessity, or even a warped sense of what it means to do right. We know many of his decisions torment him because we witness his inner struggle. Micah, on the other hand, is a vile, wicked, utterly cruel man. He acts solely for his own gain, uncaring of who he betrays or manipulates to get what he wants. He shows no empathy or remorse and seems to relish the chaos he causes. This contrast isn't accidental. It's there so we can recognize Arthur's difference. Thanks to Micah, we understand that Arthur, despite his mistakes and crimes, retains a humanity and moral sense that separates him from someone who acts with malice, like Micah. Arthur and Micah point guns at each other. At that moment, John appears alive and calls out Dutch for abandoning him. Arthur demands everyone pick a side, as this is over. Grimshaw arrives and aims at Micah, but Javier interrupts, warning that the Pinkertons are near. Micah seizes the distraction and shoots Grimshaw. Dutch, armed, questions who's with him and who's betraying him. Only John stands with Arthur, while the rest follow Dutch. Both sides aim at each other, though Javier, despite siding with Dutch, points upward. The Pinkertons burst in, ordering them to drop their weapons. The gang escapes, leaving Arthur and John alone. Arthur's life is nearing its end, but if he can reunite a family and give John a chance to start anew, that would mean something. Earlier, we saw Arthur reflect that he saw in Jack what he himself lost, and that maybe John had the chance to have the luck that always eluded him. In John, Arthur sees a reflection of himself, a man with a similar past, but with the possibility of living an honest life with his family, something Arthur always valued but lost long ago. Now, with the little time he has left, he knows that life is no longer possible for him. So, as everything around him crumbles, Arthur has found the perfect bet on love he promised Sister Calderon, saving John so he can have the life Arthur never could. Plus, this act carries powerful symbolism. By saving John, Arthur would also save Abigail and Jack, a poetic way to atone for the pain of not saving his son Isaac and Eliza. John and Arthur escape through caves toward the mountains, pursued by Dutch and Micah, with the Pinkertons waiting ahead. A bullet hits Arthur's horse, and he falls, forced to continue on foot. With enemies everywhere, Arthur faces them. He urges John to go, but Arthur says he doesn't think both can make it out alive. He decides to stay so John can escape and reunite with his family. Despite John's resistance, Arthur convinces him. Before leaving, John says, "You're my brother," to which Arthur replies, "I know." With those final words, John flees, while Arthur grabs his revolver and shoots at the Pinkertons, but is ambushed by Micah. They fight until both collapse exhausted on the ground. Arthur crawls toward his gun, while Micah says he won't make it and has already lost. Arthur replies that, despite his own efforts to the contrary, it turns out he's won. Just as Arthur reaches the revolver, Dutch stops him, standing over the gun and saying it's all over. Arthur's loyalty is so deeply ingrained that, no matter how despicable Dutch has become, he simply can't turn his back on him. Arthur remained loyal to the end, even after Dutch made decisions that led to other gang members' deaths, abandoned Abigail and John multiple times, and even left him to die. Arthur still feels the need to protect the man who practically raised him and was like a father to him. Arthur reminds Dutch that Micah is the rat, and he knows it. Before Dutch can respond, they hear the Pinkertons approaching. At that moment, Arthur assures Dutch he always gave him everything he had. Micah urges Dutch they can still escape, but Dutch, silently, turns and leaves. Micah, furious, goes the other way. With his last strength, Arthur crawls to see the sunrise one more time. He kneels, turns his face to the light, sees the deer slowly turning its head toward him again, and finally, Arthur dies. Arthur bet that love exists and won. That good man inside him, so often defeated by the giant of his circumstances and mistakes, finally emerged victorious. In his final moments, Arthur became the person Mary and Sister Calderon always knew he could be. Deep down, he earned the redemption he never thought possible and died on his own terms. Arthur went from someone who ruthlessly collected debts to becoming a debtor, someone who owed much to life and others. But in the end, he found a way to settle that debt, not through a tally of good deeds to balance his past, but through a pure act of love. And it wasn't just any act of love, it was the greatest of all, giving his life for others. There's something profoundly beautiful and symbolic in the last image Arthur sees before dying, the deer at dawn. That figure recurring in his dreams seems to close the circle of his story. In some Native American mythologies, deer were considered sacred because, it was believed, they willingly let themselves be hunted to feed people and ensure their well-being. That's exactly what Arthur did in the end. Like the deer, he sacrificed himself for others' well-being, and in that final dawn, he found the peace he never achieved in life. He not only saved John and his family, but also saved himself.